So to work on this PowerPoint, you're going to need to use both the sources that I've attached to the lesson. One is about the disaster in Aberfan back in the middle of the 20th century, and one is a 19th century text about London, okay, and an earthquake in London. I want you to make sure that you read both of those using the skills that we did last week. So using those argument skills to try and follow the argument, follow what they're saying, but make sure you read them closely and carefully. Okay, don't move on from this bit here until you've done that. So pause now until you have read both sources. Okay, so we're going back to inference here. We did quite a bit of work on inference a couple of weeks ago, or just before half term, actually, wasn't it then? That was for the holiday. Now, I want you to think back to that, and if necessary, look back at your notes on what inference was. You did a lot of good work on it, but we need to make sure we understand that skill for what we're doing here today. So, what are the key points of inference again? Firstly, that writers often do not explain everything to the reader. For example, in stories, the writer may not tell the reader the time or place. Often readers have to guess these things. We use the word guess, it's more like work out. This is called making inferences, or you could call it reading between the lines. Hopefully you're remembering this already from what we did. Okay, this is the key skill we spent a good week working on. Readers frequently need to find small clues that lead them to infer or to understand, therefore, things that the author doesn't explicitly state. They need to use information in the text to guess other things about the text. And one of the difficult things about this skill is that it isn't difficult. It's something that you do all the time. The difficult part is consciously doing it, because you normally just do it as you read. But to actually stop and think about something you do naturally is more difficult. So, for example, you might read, "The waves rushed up around his legs and he could feel the coarse sand between his toes." You would then infer, of course, that this person was at the beach. Now, of course, if you inferred further, you would also potentially infer that the person is sat by the sea, or the sea is the tide is coming in. You could potentially infer from the fact it rushed up around his legs, because obviously if it was going out, he would have been underwater to begin with. And you can tell it's a sandy beach. You can potentially tell that it's not necessarily a kind of maybe even a touristy beach, the sand being coarse maybe. Oh, okay. Lots of things you can tell if you're pushing further. Okay, so what today is about, and our work this week is about, is to transfer this skill of inference towards a wider skill, the skill that you will be using in your English language exam. And that is about comparing inferences. Okay. Now, the question that you will get, it will be the second question on the second paper in English language, will always begin with write a summary of the differences between. One caveat to that, it can be the similarities between as well, but that is something we'll deal with another time. It's not much different. So write a summary of the differences between. What's it asking you to do, therefore? To read and understand two texts at the same time. Okay, just like I asked you to do at the beginning of this session. Here's a vitally important thing for you to understand. It's not about the writer. When we look at a lot of text, you are used to picking out, because we've done a lot on literature, picking out language, picking out details, picking out techniques that the writer uses to get us to understand something, to get us to feel something. That's not really what we're doing here. We're not looking at the writer's technique here. We are thinking purely in terms of our reading. This is just a test of your reading. It's just a test of how well you can read by inferring. So this will not be about what the writer's doing. It will be about things you read about. You'll see what I mean as we go through this. Now, the third bit here, which I'm going to introduce here, is the idea of being able to comment on differences means that you need to spot what I'm calling a point of connection. Now, that's a phrase I will refer to quite a bit. I have already referred to it, and to give you some cross-reference, when we've been doing poetry for English literature. When we were doing comparison there, I've talked to you about the importance of finding a point of connection, because when you're commenting on differences, you can't just say two completely different things. You know, you have to find something connecting them. That means the differences have some importance, actually have some meaning behind them. Okay, the best way to show this is first of all to show you what that kind of looks like. So the first thing you get is this. Here's your point of connection. Okay, so with the poetry, for example, when we did it, the point of connection would often be something to do with conflict. Okay, something to do with war. It will be basically usually the thing in the connection, in the question. Now, once you've got that point of connection, so something both texts talk about, something both texts have something to say about, you then think, how does that work in source A? How does that work in source B? Now, remember, when I say how, I don't mean how is the writer writing it. I mean, well, really, what is a better way of looking at it? What does source A say about that point of connection? What does source B say about that point of connection? Okay, right. Now, I'm going to refer now to those sources that you read at the beginning. And I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by this, because this is the planning part of the answer, and it's probably the hardest part of the answer, okay, to find these points of connection. Now, the points of connection don't have to be complicated. They can be incredibly simple. And of course, the very fact that there is a connection is in the title. In this case, the question is, write a summary of the differences between Aberfan and London, the two places themselves. So the first point of connection that I find writing through it is about how lively they are. Now, of course, you're going to say to me, Aberfan isn't lively. Well, that's the point. The connection is the kind of energy, if you like, in the place, the life of the place, what kind of place they are, really. So it's really broad, okay? So I would say that for source A, for Aberfan is a dying town. It's not lively, okay? That's what it's described as, a dying town. And for source B, in source B, London is described as a vibrant city, a lively city. So there we go, big difference between them. But I found that by thinking, okay, the connection is how lively they are. Aberfan is not, London is. But of course, as we are looking at this at a slightly more advanced level, we wouldn't just say Aberfan isn't lively, London is. That's why I've used the idea of it dying and of it being vibrant and alive. Okay? So that would be one connection. I would then have to write about that, and that plan sets me up for how I show you. You've got to write about it in a minute. So going back to that idea, let's try it again. Same two, because really we need 2 points of connection, because you're going to need 2 separate paragraphs on this to make sure that you show you can use the skills more than once. So another point of connection, this shows you how different, how broad they can be. Another point of connection is that both have rivers. Okay? In fact, both have dirty rivers. Right? And source A tells us that the river that Aberfan has got is dead because it's black and awful, in the same way that the town is. Okay? So the river is also dead. But in London, the river, of course, the River Thames, it's still dirty and horrible, but it brings industry. Okay, there's all these warehouses alongside it that we read about, and that obviously means that they're part of the life of the city, even though it's dirty. Okay, so again, look at that. The point of connection between the two texts, they both talk about the fact that the places have rivers. What do they say about the rivers? In Aberfan, the river is dead, in the same way that the town is. In London, the river is part of the lifeblood of the city. It brings industry to the city. Okay, so you see, it doesn't have to be massively complicated. It's just finding the connection and being precise in what we say. Okay, so now I'm going to take you on to the idea of writing the answer. If you've struggled with the idea of what I just talked about with points of connection, when we go back to you trying this at the end of the whole section here, then maybe stop and pause and look at that. And if you really are concerned, send me those points of connection before you even try the SQI. But most people will be able to get on with this. Now, SQI is something that you only use for this question. Okay, it's an acronym, right? That just tells you the way you need to approach this, because this is a very different question to most other things that you are going to do. So first of all, it's vitally important you understand that this acronym is only used on the question in which you are using inference. Paper 2, question 2. Make sure you remember that. Okay, we've had problems before with people remembering SQI and then trying to apply it to a completely different question. SQI is only for this question. Okay, so what does it stand for? First of all, the S is a statement of difference between the two texts, because that's the first thing you're going to write down. You're just going to state the difference that there is between the two texts. And that's literally what you've just planned. Okay? The Q, which I'm sure you guessed, is quotations. Okay? Quotations, obviously at least one from each text, that explore that difference. Now again, this is an area in which some people fall down because they're not analysing language. They can forget to use details, but you must use a detail to explore it, because then that then leads you towards the inference behind what the quotation tells you. So SQI is statement, quotation, inference. Now obviously I'm going to show you what that looks like now. This is going to take a bit of getting used to, but it's a lot simpler than it might look just down there on the page. Okay, this is a lot simpler a question than it looks on the page. The key skill is this. Okay, that's why we spent so long working on what inference is. It's absolutely vital that you make use of that skill at that point, because that is where you will gain the marks that you want. Okay. Right, let's look at an example using the Aberfan and London question. Remember, the question is, write a summary of the differences between Aberfan and London. Now remember, that is between the places, not between how they're presented. So it's not between what the writer is doing with the two places, it is between the two actual places themselves based on what we've read. So here we go. So the first statement is exactly what I wrote. It came up within that first planned point of difference. Aberfan is made to sound like a dying town that has lost its soul, whereas London sounds like a vibrant industrial city. Exactly what I planned. Use of the connective whereas, which is a connective of comparison and a connective that points out the difference between something. So again, something that can be used in the same way that but, however, any of those could be the same. Just a little point. If you use however, however can't come after a comma. It would always be after a semicolon or a full stop. Okay, so there's my statement, my S. That's why it's in blue here. Now, here's the quotation. The quotation for Aberfan, first of all. Okay, now this is where I've had to look into the text, which you've got there in front of you, and I've had to find an example in which has told me that it's a dying town. Well, you know, what did I read that told me it was a dying town that's lost its soul? And that's the question you should ask yourself. If you're thinking, well, what quotation should I use? Look at what you've said about this source, what you've said about this place, in this case, that Aberfan is a dying town that's lost its soul, and think, how do I know that? Okay, so I found an example. Its environment is described as the debris of a slowly exhausting industry. Now, I've already said that it's dying. I don't want to say that again. What I want to do is, what can I infer from that statement? What does that statement actually tell me? Now, it's not the choice of the word debris makes it sound like it's falling apart. It's not the choice of the word exhausting. It is literally my reading and understanding. And this is what it tells me. It was a place of life and work, but the town is now dying very slowly and is close to breathing its last. Now, just give you a bit of time there to try and see the connection between the two of those. You might want to find that quotation that I've picked out in the extract that you've got in the source to see what it's talking about. It talks about the debris. Remember, debris is the bits and pieces that are left over after something is falling apart or is collapsing. The debris of a slowly exhausting industry. And what I've just shown is I understand what that suggests to me. Okay? A slowly exhausting industry means it's dying, and it's about to die. Now, you can see that I've been quite precise in what I've said. Not just saying it implies that the town is dying very slowly. I've pointed out it implies that it was somewhere that had more than that, because it talks about its industry. Okay, that's why I know that. All right, so it was once a place of life and work, but now, as I say, it's dying very slowly. I've mentioned it's close to breathing its last. Kind of a reference to the idea it's talking about the fact the industry is exhausting. But you see that this is what I understand, what I infer from reading it. And I want you to notice those two words at the beginning in green, which implies. Now, this will always help you to start with which implies, or which infers, or which suggests. If you do any of those, infers, implies, suggests, and you actually follow through, then you are going to talk about an inference, because those words are leading you towards that. If you say which means, then you're just going to repeat the meaning. Okay? You may want to listen to this that I'm saying several times just to make sure that you're getting this. Okay? And maybe to listen to it as you're trying it yourself. Okay, I then move on to a quotation on London. So, because I've got to compare Aberfan to London. So same thing again. How do I know London sounds like a vibrant industrial city when I read it? Because it's described as a colossal city smelling of molten metal. Hopefully you're ahead of me here, thinking what you can infer from that. If it smells of molten metal, what does it mean is happening? Okay? If it's colossal, what does it tell you about that city? Okay, so my inference is this, that it's alive with industry because it's smelling of molten metal. Okay? But look at my additional point. Just like I said before, this was a place of life and work. This is how I'm moving to the higher levels. I've noted it's a place that smells of molten metal. That's not nice. Okay? So it is alive with industry, but it's not going to be a very pleasant place to live. A deeply unpleasant place to live. So you can see in the green there, which is the most important part, how inference is working. You can see how I've stretched myself to a higher level in this, and you can see the pattern. It's SQI, but it really is SQI QI to make sure that I cover both of them. Okay? Of course, I could say Aberfann's environment describes the debris of a slowly exhausting industry, while London is a colossal city smelling of molten metal, which suggests that Aberfan was a place of life and work, but the town is now dying very slowly and close to breathing its last, while London is alive with industry, but a deeply unpleasant place to live. So I could organise it like that if I wanted, just to keep an SQ and an I. Okay. Now, one paragraph is not enough. I need to show I can do this twice. Okay. So I start with another statement, and that's my second point of connection that I made. So the rivers are both dirty and horrible, I pointed out, but, and there's my whereas again, whereas London's still has some life to it, Aberfann's is of no use anymore. And once again, I'm not talking about what the writer is saying. I'm talking about the river in London as far as I understand it from having read that. I'm talking about the river in Aberfan as far as I understand it from having read that source. Okay, so this is Aberfan. Now, here is a slightly more advanced point, and this is something I'm going to suggest to you, that maybe having in your first paragraph use some inferences which are pretty straightforward, getting you the points. You've made very clear what you've got to say. Maybe in your second, you could just try and do something a little bit different. Okay, you could just try and look at something a little bit more, here's the phrase, perceptive. Now, I'm particularly talking to those of you who will be aiming at the highest marks here, but that's what we're looking at. Now, you'll have noticed in Aberfan that he calls the river, he refers to it as being like the river Styx, and there is a reference in that extract to what the river Styx was, if you didn't know, that it was the river that people had to cross to get to the underworld in Greek mythology. So, by comparing it to that, what do I infer from that? Well, it makes it sound like Aberfan is itself turned to the land of the dead. If that's the river going through it, and the river Styx goes past the land of the dead, it's telling me Aberfan's turning to the land of the dead. It's not language analysis, that is inferring the meaning behind telling me it's that. With London's, it talks about the vast warehouses on its banks. Now, again, that is a little bit more of an inference here, because I'm thinking, okay, it's got these huge warehouses on the banks of the river. What does that tell me? It tells me it's vital to the industry and transport of the area. Why would you build vast warehouses on the banks of the river? Because that's where the transport is coming. You wouldn't have them there nowadays. Okay, you don't have vast warehouses for Amazon by the river anymore, because that's not how people deliver it. You have them near motorways. Okay, you have them relatively near airports usually as well, because that's how transport works. And we spent a long time on that as an example, but the reason is that when you look at this and you look at this example, it covers everything you need. Okay. The green is the key parts, it's the inference. What I've tried to do here is do two clear differences between them. The type of town they are, the impact of the rivers. I've explored each one through a quotation and what I can infer from that. Not analysing language, but inferring. And then in the second, I've just tried to push it on a little bit to make it a little bit more perceptive and give me a chance of getting into the highest marks. Now, the big issue people have with this is that they don't infer, okay? They repeat what's going on, or they they analyse a word, and that obviously means they don't get the marks, that they don't quote, okay, they're the key things that you've got to work on. If you just follow this, it's actually not as hard a task as you think. You've done the work on inference, so you have practiced that skill. Now it's just applying it to this skill of comparison. So over to you. We're now going back to the sources that you used in the last week, okay, when you were looking at the arguments on the child prisons. Now we're not interested in the arguments anymore, okay? What we're interested in is those as things you read and infer about. Now you can see in the question, it's very clear it's not the differences between the writer's view of the child prisons, the writer's view of children going to prisons, nothing to do with that at all. It is the child prisons themselves. The child prison as you read it in source A, the child prison as you read it in source B. Okay, that is all you're being asked to look for. So, what are you going to do? First thing you're going to do is remind yourself of the texts and of course of the arguments. You're not going to be using the arguments, but it allows you to understand and remind yourself where you came with this. You're going to find 2 points of connection and how each source is different. Think of that little diagram that we used. Again, use what I did as a model. And finally, you're going to use SQI to write a paragraph for each section, for each of those 2 points of connection. Okay? Again, you have a model there to work from. I want you then, of course, to send me that response. It should only be 2 paragraphs long. It doesn't have to be long at all. Okay? In the end, you won't have much time to write this. But take your time on this just to get it right and feel comfortable with it. Okay? Email that to me and we'll see how you get on with it. Good luck.